One of the most important skills in card games is knowing what can happen in an upcoming battle. In case of Riftbound, that means knowing the action and reaction cards an opponent can have, understanding their possible synergies, and then combining that knowledge with the amount of open resources they currently possess. In this video, I will help you, both you and myself, learn the average values that meta decks present in common situations that you will find in your games. I'm gonna start with Kaisa because not only she's the most popular legend, but also has a wide array of tools that are very meaningful during battles. So she's a great example to learn what can an opponent do when they have 1 resource open, 2 resources open, or 3 resources open. And those are the scenarios in which I will mostly focus my learnings here. And don't worry, I'm gonna make a Excel spreadsheet as well, which I will be updating with the future releases to keep this, let's say, video updated towards the future. There are gonna be few important things to explain that will also apply to any other character in the game, so let's focus during this segment. The first concept I would like to focus on is how dealing damage is different from affecting might, and how that will change your mindset in choosing your units that will attack a battlefield. First example is going to be a Kaisa with 1 resource open. In this case, she's going to be able to play Hextech Ray, deals 3, Stupefy, -1 might, and Cleave +3 might, but only if she's attacking. So, we know that this is not going to be the case. And now I would like to explain that concept. If Hextech Ray can be played on our unit, it will only have an effect if our units have 3 or less might. So, for example, if I have multiple units on my in my base and I want to choose them to attack a battlefield, if I'm going to choose a 4 and a 3 to attack together on a battlefield, then I have to think that Hextech Ray essentially means -3 might to my units, because she will be able to target the cub, kill it, and it essentially means -3. But if I will choose 2 4s to attack, then that means that Hextech Ray doesn't essentially affect the damage that I'm gonna deal, which is different from Stupefy, because Stupefy always affects the damage that I will deal, so that it will change the way that you think about how units should survive or how units will trade with the opponents depending on the mana open. And that's very important to understand, because it's gonna change the dynamic of how you will attack the battlefields and the order of it. If an opponent Kaisa has 3 resources open, then I have like a small checklist. We're gonna have to first check how many cards does the Kaisa have in hand, because if it's only 2 cards, when that essentially destroys all the 3-card combos. You can also remember how many copies of each of the particular cards were already used, which will affect the probabilities of what can happen in the upcoming battle. But now, with the 3 resources, we have a lot of combinations. First and foremost, Void Seeker can be played, and essentially its value of 4, which we already talked about, that it's common value for 2 resources. So that is not on rate essentially when you think about how you approach Kaisa, because of the draw 1 that is on this card. But now with 3 resources and the other cards, there are some lethal combos. You have to be ready for the worst case scenario, and a worst case scenario is gonna be a Smokescreen and a Hextech Ray combined together, because that's a difference of 7. If your creature is less than 7, like, yeah, this is gonna be very traumatic experience for you, and it's only a 2-card combo, so it's -7. Then of course you can have like an option of Stupefy plus Hextech Ray and another Stupefy, which is 5, or 2 Hextech Ray and a Stupefy, which is also 7. And then also Cleave if it's attack. Of course, Cleave and Smokescreen is also difference of 7. 2 Cleaves and a Stupefy is also 7. But then, for example, 2 Hextech Rays and a Cleave is a difference of 9, but I wouldn't focus on it. The main thing that I would like to focus here is, if we don't expect a Void Seeker, the values range from 5 to 9, but 9 is not that likely. So essentially, 7 is the number that you would like to think when opponent has 3 resources open, if you want to be very vigilant about what can happen in the upcoming battle. Just because the game is new and not everyone has all the cards, Falling Comet in Kaisa can also be a consideration when people have to substitute something that they are lacking of. So in case of 5 mana open, just remember that this is a possibility, 6 damage to the battlefield with just 1 card. So now when I'm fighting a Kaisa and I just take a glimpse of her resources open, I'm gonna associate with it like that. 1 resource, value of 3. 2 resources, value of 4. 3 resources, value of 7. Oh, nice. Just wanted to add that I will think about a value of 7 when my opponent has a lot of cards in his hand, but if he doesn't, then I will think about a value of 4. So that's gonna be the most common occurrence that I will immediately think about when I see the open resources that my opponent has. Knowing this will really speed up the process of your decision making when it comes to calculating combat, which will save you massive amount of time in the games that you're gonna play at tournaments. So now let's talk how do we approach Master Yi. It's gonna be much simpler than Kaisa. With just one resource open, essentially the only option is On Guard, which is basically always a difference of 2 might. Now when we add another resource and we get 2, essentially it becomes also 2 because we just add another copy of a card, which is Discipline. So there's a high chance it's just gonna be 2 mana resource open, or 1 resource open. It's always gonna be 2 unless an opponent will have 2 copies of Vanguard, which then essentially means it's gonna be a difference of 4. But overall, you should account that 2 resources open should be a difference of 2. I cannot ignore some of the more uncommon choices. For like example, Rune Prison for 2 mana is essentially -1 of your creatures because it deletes completely its value, right? So it might not mean that your creature will die, but you have to think that one of your creatures, the bigger the creature, the more effective the card is. So keep that in mind. The stun is pretty significant in some of the matchups. Now, I don't think I typically will see a Yi use a challenge, but this card will have an impact specifically also when an opponent will have a unit that is on a different battlefield or in their base. But I wouldn't worry that much about challenge in a specific Yi match. And also a very uncommon card, but I think is actually pretty decent and probably will see some play at some point. Block for a 2 mana spell that can be hidden as well, giving +3 and a tank. This can be a very potential, like, big swing in a lot of potential battles, but specifically for the mid-range version of Yi rather than the big ramp version that Aurora plays. So have that in mind. I feel like this card might be in the future also a choice. So now let's go to 3 open resources against the Yi, and it's gonna be most likely On Guard and Discipline, which will mean a difference of 4. Now, as you can see, there's a big difference when battling against a Kaisa and a Yi because the number at 3 resources typically is gonna be lower than against a Yi. But now also remember that in general Yi will have access to Windfall and Defy, which will affect your own buffs if you want to play something. So you have to keep those 2 cards into account in the math if you want to play any damage spells or buffs. But when it comes that you don't really plan on anything like that, then just think about the 4 as being the number for 3 resources. Now let's go into 4 resources, and that's essentially a combo, right? So we either have 2 copies of Discipline, which is basically 4, or 2 copies of Vanguard and 1 copies of Discipline, which is essentially 6. That's easy to calculate with this amount of open of mana because you will typically also see some of them in the graveyard, so you can calculate how often this can happen. Not very often, right? So combining that with the knowledge about how big the hand of the opponent is, you can be expecting like, oh, this is not really that common that I'm gonna get a +6 or even +4 here in this particular scenario. But some of the Yi decks do play Primal Strength. In that case, that is +7 in every single scenario because that's just how the card works. So let's summarize Yi. With 1 resource open, it's gonna be a value of 2. 2 resources open, it's gonna be also a value of 2, very rarely up to 4, but typically you have to be ready for 2. 3 resources open, you're gonna have a value of combined 4, because that's gonna be the combo of Discipline plus On Guard. And with 4 resources open, you're gonna have most likely a 1 card which is gonna be 7 with Primal Strength, but also if there's gonna be a combination of Disciplines and On Guards, then you have to just count 4, 6, or 7. But typically that is gonna be most likely 7 if it's anything. Let's talk about Sett now, because he's the peculiar one, because he's the only deck right now in the game, at least correct me if I'm wrong, that can play a reaction speed buff to a creature that is gonna be 0 resources and it will mean +3, which is very important to know when you play against this deck. But also there's a small caveat to it. If you're gonna pay attention to what's happening on the Sett board, if the creature that has the buff is in combat and there's no other creatures with a buff at that time, that means that the only creature that can play the Call to Glory for 0 resources will have to remove its buff, which means that from the +3, we get +2 because we have to spend the buff on a creature that is already in combat. Very important information for you to quickly calculate how much can happen for 0 resources. Other than that, the only card that buffs creatures is a copy of Primal Strength, which is for 4 resources, and that's +7, right? And or just multiple copies of Call to Glory. But it's hard to calculate that because, you know, there can be, depending on how much mana is open, if like 3 resources open, 1 buff on the board, that means that we can get +5 or +6, depending on how those buffs are gonna be spent. If there are multiple buffs on the board and opponent will just spend those buffs for multiple copies of Call to Glory, this is gonna be like +4, maybe +5, maybe +6. But it's hard to calculate that because, again, card is for 0 mana. And what I learned in like my history in playing TCGs is that cards for 0 mana incredibly powerful, and it's very hard to play around them. So for 1 resource, we're not going to be talking about anything over here that is common when it comes to the popular set builds, but for 2 resources, there are some very nifty options over here. Hidden Blade, a removal that draws you cards when your creature gets removed, typically is not going to be played until the end of the game. When the game is closing out, that's where Sett is going to try to kind of sneak in the Hidden Blade, so you will not have the chance to use the draw 2 as an effect, right? So think about that card happening way more often at the end game than in the early or mid game, because if it happens then, no biggie, like you're drawing cards, it's gonna be fine. Challenge, we already discussed this. Pay attention with 2 resources open, what can kill your creatures that is on a different battlefield than you're attacking or in base. That's the important context of what you need to think about when a challenge is typically happening, right? Action speed as well, very important. If a set has 3 resources open, then we essentially just think about Call to Glory without like the side effect, right? It's just +3 for 3 resources, but then there's a chance that it's going to be another one. So essentially it's like +5, maybe +6 if a set has 3 resources open and there's a possibility of 2 Call to Glories happening at the same time. The other thing that is not going to be such a common occurrence is back-to-back. I feel like if there's a set version that plays more like, you know, wide, more tokens and stuff like that, back-to-back might be an option, but it is +2/+2 for 2 units, but they cannot be the same target, right? So it's only for 2 units. So that's an important information, but it's not a common occurrence, so I wouldn't like think too much about back-to-back right now. And a very rare option, but at a local level can actually be played a lot. Phase Breaker affects you and your opponent creature, so essentially it is something to think about. It can be an option, especially if it's a hidden card, because you will play around like a Hidden Blade, but then it's a Phase Breaker and you're gonna be like caught very off guard. So just take it into your mind when planning an attack against hidden cards of Sett that it can be a Phase Breaker in some rare situations. Very rare options that I don't see currently being played, and they would require completely new archetypes or like a meta change, like for example Viktor suddenly plays. Cannon Barrage and Fury Blades are gonna be mass removal for small units, which can be an option for a, you know, buffier set to play around a wide board, but those typically are not being used now. So 1 mana, 1 damage, 2 mana, 2 damage to all units.
And both are reactions.
So to summarize Sett, essentially we have to think this way. If there was not a Call to Glory used at all in the game, we have to think about a potential +2 or +3 for whatever resources the opponent has open. And if they have more open mana than 2, so 3, you have to think about 2 Call to Glories. If there's 4, then it's Primal Strength, but otherwise, I would say that you don't have to think about too many tricks when it comes to playing against the Sett. Playing against Annie is a little bit different. We're going to start with the things that we already discussed against Kaisa. So Cleave and Voidseeker for 1 mana during an attack, value of 3. On defense for 1 mana, we essentially have almost nothing, but sometimes post-board Gust, but we're going to talk about that in a second. And then for 3 resources, we have Voidseeker, value of 4, but again, it's damage. It's not reduction of might. So we have to take a little bit different approach, which I explained during the Kaisa matchup. But now let's talk about the 2 resources open against Annie, which is gonna be the most common thing because they always untap 2 resources at the end of the turn. So we have to always play around Fight or Flight or Ride the Wind, but they depend on the context. Fight or Flight moves your unit to the base, which means that when you fight, when you set up a fight against an Annie, you have to take into account that your biggest unit at that battlefield is gonna be not counting to the damage, right? So essentially it's minus X, where X is your biggest creature, while Right the Wind is easier to play around because you can see what opponent has at different part of the map. So if there's a unit in base or there's a unit on a different battlefield that you're attacking, that unit can be moved to the battlefield that you currently have a showdown at, right? So there's a very known value that 2 resources on Right the Wind can get. If there's a creature with 3 might on a different battlefield or in base, that means that Right the Wind is gonna have value of 3. So pay attention to what is on the board for Annie when it comes to 2 resources. Now, post board against Annie, you're gonna expect also Rebuke, which is essentially another copies of Fight or Flight, so you have to think about even more probability of your unit going back, in this case to your hand instead of the base, but it effect is the same when it comes to the showdown outcome. And Gust, which will only affect your creatures that have 3 power or less, and then you have essentially the 3 of the same effect over here that will affect the showdown in a very similar fashion. So I wouldn't associate any kind of values to the open resources that Annie has, and you just have to pay more attention to what creatures are on the board, and that context will dictate how effective the resources of the Annie will be. It's essentially kind of hard and easy to play around Annie at the same time. When you start talking about Viktor, let's just preface it. At 6 resources, action plus 5 to everything. Just remember about that. That's a thing, right? So with that out of the way, let's focus now on the lower amount of resources. At 1 resource, we just have Stupefy, which is value of 1. That's essentially it. There's no other options, at least not in current versions of the Viktor that we have. Then at 2 resources, in many cases, it's gonna be actually more often Smokescreen than anything else, which is value of 4. Typically, right? Then we have also an option which is Siphon Power for 2 resources, but you don't really see it that often. So it's essentially, you have to calculate it based on context. If there are 2 creatures at the board, is a difference of 2. But every creature adds +1. So the more creatures are on the board, the bigger effect of the 2 power Siphon Power is. So take that into account. Depending on the context of the battlefields. Now, similarly to Sett, there is a Hidden Blade in this deck, but also think about it this way. This card matters more as a removal once you're closer to the end game rather than early game and mid game. If you're gonna get hit by this for some reason in early and mid game, you're not worried. So don't really think too much about Hidden Blade. And maybe, but probably not, for 3 resources, you're gonna have essentially +4 for Viktor because he probably will attack with you with 2 creatures. So this is a swing of 4. So to summarize, essentially you have 1 resource for Viktor, it's 1. 2 resources for Viktor is a 4. I would say it like that. I would predict it's gonna be a 4, right? And then at 3 resources, it's also most likely gonna be a 4. But depending on the context, it can be a combination of Siphon Power and Stupefy. But remember, context matters because it cannot be less than 1 might for each of your creatures. And a valid choice for Victors as well for 2 resources, but again, you cannot assign any value to it. It really depends on the context. Your biggest creature can be stunned and their smallest creature can be stunned as well. For 2 resources can be hidden, so it can be like, there can be 2 options when it comes to the hidden cards, 1 Hidden Blade or a Face Breaker. But in general, playing around reaction and action cards against a Viktor is pretty easy. Thank you very much for watching, and if you have a suggestion on what kind of topic would you like to see in the next video, let me know in the comments.